Let me begin by noting that the issue of peak oil, what works, what doesn't, it's an issue that's come to everyone's fore in the last several years. And it's also an issue that's very difficult to get your hands around, and it's also going to be an issue that's going to be difficult to establish a policy course for how, in fact, we deal with it. And hopefully I can present some ideas from the experience and the work that we've done in Southern California. We are, in many respects, one of the largest regions in the country. There's only one larger, and that's the New York region. And not that we have the same problems as New York, but as you'll see, I believe all the large metropolitan regions, not only in the United States but globally, have very similar issues, and they relate to the subject matter that you've been struggling with. I'm terribly impressed that after several days on a Friday afternoon, the room is still filled. That tells me you have a room of incredibly dedicated, interested individuals who intend to make a difference on this issue. Many have said that the peak oil is really a transportation growth-driven issue. And I would like to explore some of the parts of the growth transportation dimensions of this issue. In Southern California, and I've been in my position now 30 years. Prior to that time, I was at EPA, and I participated in the very first air quality plan that Bill Ruckelshaus was directed by a court order to go out to California and announce. How have we looked at the issue of transport and land use within our region? It's fundamentally, interestingly enough, been driven by air quality over the last several decades. And in preparing all the air quality plans, the one that I participated in at EPA, as well as we're now on our 7th, and it's coming out the month that we're now in, there's been really 3 fundamental keys to it, particularly on the transportation side. One is technology, another is transit, and the third is land use. Let me just give you a little bit of history. In our very first plan in 1979, we said we're going to have 10% of our fleet by the year 2010 to be precise, when we had to achieve standards, was going to be electric. With respect to transit, when I came to my position, we had 25% of all public dollars were in transit. Today it's 68%. And in the area of land use, we said we need to have a housing job balance. And anyone who looks at California today would say, gosh, if that's a balanced region, then that term housing job balance really is an oxymoron. In fact, in all 3 areas, we do not have a 10% penetration in electric vehicles. In fact, we have hardly any. There isn't even 0.1% electric in our region. In the area of transit, even though we've dramatically changed the expenditure pattern, our mode split for transit has gone up from about 4% to 6%. You cannot spend 68% of all of your dollars in a mode that carries 8% of the people and hope to sustain and not have a political revolution. And in the area of land use, we worked for decades. You might say, well, gee, if these are the 3 cornerstones of how we're going to deal with this issue, how in the heck do we make progress not only on air quality, but how are we going to make progress on peak oil? Well, in the last 10 years, we've focused our air quality attention not only on the ambient standards, but also on the issue of global warming. Our last air plan 5 years ago had a chapter on global warming. A person who sat on our committees in the development of that plan, an Assemblywoman, Fran Pavlik, was successful in getting the state of California and the governor of our state, Arnold Schwarzenegger, to pass the first truly global warming policy for this country. Thank you. And the issue of when you look at global warming and you look at the issue of transportation, what you basically see is that the emission sources are very much the same. The emission sources that I addressed earlier in air quality, and the question is, okay, now how are we going to get serious about this? How are we going to get some policies, and how, in fact, do we move this issue forward? Let me make the observation that in global warming, and it really took, I believe, about 10 to 15 years to bring our state, and hopefully our state will lead other states, as we now see that happening, to adopt a policy, and we'll get our country to have a policy and join the global marketplace of leaders. But it took us about 15 years to get us to the point where our public was convinced, and the support for that bill within our state is significant. More important, the support within our business community in our state was absolutely critical for the passage of that bill. And our business community within the state of California sees global warming as an opportunity to restructure the economy in our state. So I'm going to suggest that if peak oil, if air quality, if transportation congestion, if global warming, if we start integrating the policies that we're dealing with, then we're going to possibly have a chance on all of them. If we deal with them singularly, I'm going to suggest that we will struggle in the field until it truly is the crisis that many of you have been speaking about. Now, let me share a few observations about the issue of growth and what transformations are occurring globally. As you go through your energy evolutions, and Mumford describes this in the City in History, we had coal, and that drove an industrial era. You had petroleum, and that drove a post-industrial era. Well, we're now in a third era, and I call it, I think all of us recognize we are in a global era. And that global era is changing the way we grow within the region. The map you see in front of you is the result of the work of myself and my colleagues trying to understand what's the growth and development in this country over the next 50 years. And by the way, if you take a look at USA Today, they had the lead story in USA Today was this very map. It was in a dot form, but it was this map. And it basically shows how we're going to grow and develop this country over the next 50 years. And essentially what you see, the areas in blue are losing population, the areas in red are gaining population. And what you basically find in putting all the data and information together is that what is happening in our country is that the growth and development in the United States will be in about 8 or 9, maybe 10 large mega regions. And what's happening in the rest of the country is it's emptying out. In fact, 2/3 of all the population and employment and about 80 to 85% of all the economic activity will occur in these economic regions. Why? Very simple answer. They have ports and they have airports that connect them with the global world. I can show you the map of Europe, the map of Asia, and what's happening is that the same phenomenon is occurring in almost every single continent. And that is you're going to have growth in very large metropolitan areas, and we're restructuring the world. We're restructuring along what economic form and what economic theory, I'm not quite sure, other than to say it's a network theory of production and distribution and consumption. A very different pattern of growth than we've had in the past. And let me also note that the air quality and the environmental issues in these mega regions are among the worst that you'll find anywhere. And therefore, the need to develop responses and solutions to the problems of these metropolitan areas, I'm going to argue it's going to give us a policy framework around which we can really get our hands around this collective set of issues, ranging from air quality, global warming, transportation, housing costs, and not to leave out the one you're working on, peak oil. What we did in our region is we spent about 5 or 6 years developing a growth framework for our region. And that growth framework basically said, how are we going to grow and develop? How are we going to accommodate the 6 to 8 million people that we're talking about? And we came forth with the following growth vision for our region. And it was a very simple concept behind it. You grow on 2% of the landmass, and that is around transit centers and on transportation corridors, mixed use. We took the notions of smart growth and we made them real. And we developed a number of goals ranging from mobility to prosperity, and let me say in prosperity, the notion of us being a trading center, a logistics center for the world is the key to our prosperity. We found that the people who work in that industry make more money than the people who work in manufacturing, and that yes, you can in fact rebuild an economy even if you're a global economy and you're not directly producing things. On the area of sustainability, the issue that you're concerned with today is right at the top of the page, as well as the issue of open space. What we found is that the vision of building along these transportation corridors transforms the way the region works. And I just want you to take a look at the slide in terms of in the plan. Those percentages numbers are not absolute numbers, they're plan effectiveness numbers. But you can see that there's substantial reductions that we gain in our region by having a different growth pattern, developing differently, and furthermore, you can see that there are substantial energy savings that will be accrued, that we will accrue if in fact we move forward on this overall program. And last but not least, we take our transit mode split and we get it up to the 12 to 15% that we need given our level of investment. Now the question you're going to ask is, how in fact do you make it real? And let me just say that the other observation that I want to share with you, and that is, if we relate these public policies and this transformation that we're going through to market activities, and we condition the market, then we're now finding that we're making progress on the issue of job housing balance, on the issue of smart growth. We don't call it smart growth, we call it strategic growth. And we're getting cities to transform and change their general plans. Debbie and her city and Huntington Beach is included, but we have over 40 cities right now within a period of 2 to 3 years that are now changing their general plans to modify how they're going to grow and develop, to build around the transit systems, and to build different urban forms to address the multiple issues that we're looking at. How do we do that? I would say that and we've built partnerships with the private sector. The builders, in fact, are our biggest supporters. The realtors are our supporters. The most difficult piece of the equation are the elected officials, and for good reason. They have constituents that don't necessarily want this, are uncomfortable with it, but if we frame it in market terms, we're finding that we're getting progress and traction. What do I mean by market terms? I'm just going to show you a few slides and observations to explain what we mean by market terms. This is a normal development process within a city or on individual projects. Up to now, the information that I'm flashing on the screen, only the project proponent had that information. An individual developer, when he makes a decision, runs through that list of steps. We now have the capacity and tools and planning expertise to be able to say, now we can calculate what the return on investment would be, not just for one project, but for all the projects in a given area. And we can calculate what the community return on investment is, and that those changes in policy that a community makes, and I'll show you a few examples, can be translated into not only developer benefit, but community benefit. These are parking requirements. You can see the one circled down there, 5, and then you can look at the number of parking spaces up in the top. These are the factors that a developer would use. You change a few policies with respect to parking requirements, number of spaces, and you translate that into the map for a given area, and we can start calculating, given a change in policy, what the improvement would be in terms of development value. And then you put in place financing tools and structure where you capture portions of those revenues, and all of a sudden, the changes in public policy, the changes in land use, the changes in development begin to take on financial terms. And those financial terms can be expressed in accumulated number of dollars. Well, those dollars can go into financing the community facilities, can go into financing the transit and other activities, so that communities aren't faced with, gee, you're going to put in more density and I'm not going to get any benefit or any amenities. Another way of looking at this issue was in terms of the large-scale projects that we build in our region. This is the checkbook for our region. The total expenditure is $94 billion. We're anticipating that of that, private investments, namely revenue-backed projects, will pay for at least 2/3 of them. Now, you would ask, give me a specific. We move the nation's goods. Moving goods through rail and moving on trucks is the area where we need the greatest investments in our region. How are we going to pay for it? We need to spend at least $44 billion to build these facilities. Well, what we did is that we calculated the actual benefit that will accrue to the shipping industry, and that what we found is that all the innovations that we put together saved the shippers in this country about 18 to 20% of their inventory. It's cheaper to buy product in our region than it is to buy it in China where they make it. Why? Because our transportation efficiencies are greater than their cost of producing it. Now the question is, how do we capture a percentage of that to pay for our facilities? So we did an elasticity study, complicated term, but we mapped the global movement of goods, and we found that if you put a $200 container fee on every container that comes into our port, it's actually saving the consumers in this country a lot of money, and that the private sector is willing, it should be willing, in fact, is willing to pay if the facilities to achieve that productivity is achieved. So again, collecting revenues to pay for facilities. Well, then you're going to ask, now what does that mean to the issue we're talking about? Well, this is the expenditure that we need within our region. And then we also calculated we need to spend another $10 billion changing the fuel sources. We need to alter the fuels so that they're not just diesel, both on trucks and trains, that there's electrification, and that there are alternative fuels with respect to the transport facilities. Let me conclude by stating the notion of changing the financing structure, changing the way we approach the way we grow and develop. And by the way, I can't tell you the number of elected officials, planning consultants, and developers who've said, you know, this is making smart growth, which we beat our head against the wall for 10 to 15 years, real. When you translate it into economic terms where it makes dollars and cents to individuals, then all of a sudden the abstract planning becomes real. Our expectation is that we will do the same thing with respect to the movement of goods in our region. Let me just say, diesel toxicity right now is more important to the constituents and the people who live in our region than global warming or anything else, because diesel toxicity is now the most acute form of cancer and asthma forming agent within the United States, and we have it in spades. If we're able to use the market to build the facilities to mitigate that, we're going to do several things. Air quality will improve, we're going to change the fuel source, and furthermore, we're going to have a region that is able to have economic growth and productivity. Now the question is, what's the next policy agent that we ought to be focusing on? Let me suggest that for this issue that we're working on today, I would say that the single most policy issue that, given the local lessons that we've learned from our region that we need to work on federally, is the reauthorization of the federal transportation bill. The current federal transportation bill, it makes a mockery of our intergovernmental finance system. It's 7,000 pork barrel demonstration programs, and you got the largest here in Boston, but the rest of the country's right behind you in getting their demonstration projects, and there's no public policy in it. We need to change that piece of legislation. The Highway Trust Fund is running out of money, needs to be reauthorized. The time frame for the bill is 2 years from now. And what is the issue that we should be focusing on? Federal instruments that put in place a real financing system where users pay for what they get. I don't care whether it's development or movement of goods or even transit. And if you have a nexus between the user and what they're using, you're going to have better transportation decisions, land use decisions, and furthermore, we now have the information base to include externalities. You start changing the way we finance things in this country, and these issues that we're trying to get our hands around as isolated issues become real. Thank you.